Good evening. More funerals have taken place for the Palestinians killed by Israeli troops in Gaza yesterday. An emergency session of the UN Security Council has heard condemnation of both Israel and the militant group Hamas. Today, in fact, marks the 70th anniversary of what Palestinians call the catastrophe, when hundreds of thousands of people fled or were expelled from their homes when the State of Israel was established. Our Middle East editor Jeremy Bowen sent this report from Gaza, and the report does contain some distressing images.
On the border, the soundtrack was anti-Israeli songs, not gunfire. 24 hours after the killing, the big protests have stopped. But tires were burning and Palestinians looked warily towards the Israeli positions. Enterprising traders brought refreshments. So what's next? The Israelis deal with the international political fallout. The Palestinians have 60 dead. Politicians and diplomats abroad call for peace, but real peace talks failed a long time ago. And with the current generation of Palestinian and Israeli leaders, there is no chance of them being revived. The Israelis started firing tear gas. The crowd, by then including many families, was getting too big. And the young men were getting too close to the border wire. On the other side, the Israelis say they're in the right.
We are not here looking to create casualties of Palestinians. That is not our aim. We are simply here to defend what is ours. We are defending our sovereignty, our civilians that live in close proximity, against an onslaught led by a terrorist organization that is using civilians in order to penetrate into Israel.
Much of Gaza's rage is born in places like Beach Camp, still a home for refugees 70 years after more than 700,000 Palestinians fled or were forced out of their homes by newly independent Israel. Palestinians call it Nakba, catastrophe. 70% of Palestinians in Gaza are refugees, stuck fast in history. At the Al Farouk Mosque, Yazan Tobasi's funeral was much quieter than his death, shot through the eye during the protests. His body was wrapped in the Hamas flag. He was 23 and his friends were there to bury him. There were tender moments. Israel says it told them to stay away from the border and Hamas is responsible for what happened. His friend Mohammed al-Barawi said Yazan had worked at the hospital without pay because of Gaza's collapsing economy. Poverty and grief breed anger. And so do the deaths of children. A family gathered for another funeral. It was for Layla Al-Khandour, who was 8 months old. She had a weak heart, and when she inhaled tear gas, she died, her family said. Children make up half Gaza's population. 6 were killed on Monday, according to the Ministry of Health. Her mother, Mariam, was in a pit of grief. At Shifa, the main hospital, wounded men were being transferred to Egypt for surgery. Inside, they were still treating casualties from the protest. This boy is 16. All day I've been asking Palestinians if Hamas forced them to risk their lives at the protests. No one said yes. I did it because Jerusalem is Palestinian, said Wadir Aras, unemployed, 24 years old. This is the busiest time at the hospital since the 2014 war.
As a human being, I speak, it's horrible to think about. If you see yesterday the situation, it's horrible. Crying, bloody, painful. What's happening?
After the protests, it seems that many people are hoping for some kind of turning point. But the fundamentals of this conflict don't change. Jeremy Bowen, BBC News, Gaza.
Jeremy was focusing on there. The hostility between Israel and the Palestinians has long centred on the land and the borders created following that war that led to the establishment of Israel back in 1948. And our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucette, takes a closer look now at the history of this continuing struggle.
A history of a people on the run, time and again. 1948, the Arab-Israeli War at the creation of Israel. Tens of thousands of Palestinians fled to Gaza, many forced from their homes. A narrow sliver of land became known as the Gaza Strip, its borders defined by the positions of Egyptian and Israeli forces, separate from the West Bank when the 1948 ceasefire was declared. And for the next 70 years, Gaza's future would be shaped by its neighbours, most of all, the State of Israel. In 1967, in the Six-Day War, Israel occupied Gaza and the West Bank, started building Jewish settlements on the best land, including along the Mediterranean. And then, decades later, a promise of land for peace. The last settlers and soldiers would leave in 2005, proclaiming the end of Israeli occupation. But Israel kept control of all borders, land, air and sea. Gazans called it the world's biggest prison. But Palestinian politics played its part too. The next year, elections brought the militant group Hamas to power, pushing out Fatah, the main Palestinian faction, and pushing Gaza towards a growing confrontation with Israel and a tightening blockade, which created a growing humanitarian crisis. In the last 10 years, 3 wars. And in between, efforts to ease Gaza's blockade, but never enough, and never enough aid. At the UN Security Council today, the same calls for restraint, and the US stood by its ally.
I asked my colleagues here in the Security Council, who among us would accept this type of activity on your border? No one would. No country in this chamber would act with more restraint than Israel has.
And the same calls to return to peace talks.
We see negotiations towards a two-state solution as the best way to end the occupation and to meet the national aspirations of the Jewish and Palestinian peoples.
Gaza's fate has been sealed, literally, by its borders. The only route to a better future through negotiations. But that's now further away than ever. Lise Doucette, BBC News.
Lise Doucette, our chief international correspondent on the continuing hostility between Israel and the Palestinians.